Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our story of the continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In this series, we're talking now about the early American period, and in the last two episodes, we talked about the arrival of Andrew Jackson, how he established the first fundamentals of government for city and county. Next, we have begun to talk about the city itself, its complex, and then last time we began talking a little bit about the arrangement here following the issuance of the Monroe Doctrine of, first of all, a South Atlantic naval fleet, and then, of course, a Navy Yard to protect that fleet. And as we left you last time, Commodore Warrington had just begun the fundamentals of putting the Navy Yard together. Now, of course, Mr. Warrington was here about 2.5 to 3 years, and at that time he was sent on to more responsible duties, and he was replaced by a man named Melanchthon Woolsey. And Mr. Woolsey also did an excellent job of carrying forth the work that Warrington had laid out. And of course, by the time Woolsey had been here about 6 months, Warrington Village, the place where the workmen and their families were staying, had pretty well been filled. And so Mr. Woolsey used architectural and surveying talents, laid out a new village, and of course, with all due modesty, he named that one for himself, and this became known as the village of Woolsey. Now, those who are old-timers in this area will recall that Old Warrington and Woolsey maintained themselves there well into the 20th century before they were that property was required by the Navy itself, and the Old Warrington was moved to become New Warrington. But that's a different story. Now, once the Navy Yard was begun, now the Coast Artillery sent a new emissary here to build the protective forts that were to be a string around to prevent any kind of attack against the Navy Yard itself. And the man they sent was young Captain William Henry Chase. Chase was a West Point graduate, and most recently he had been the engineer in charge of repairing the old forts along the Mississippi River at New Orleans. He had a good deal of experience, and he came here with a series of plans that had been done at the Navy Department, or at the Coast Artillery Department, led by a General Totten, who was the chief architect for the artillery. The plans called this way. There were to be 3 forts and a redoubt. And the 3 forts were to be, the first one was to be on Santa Rosa Island on its western tip. The second one was to be just across the Narrows on the extension of Perdido Key. The third one is to be on the high ground just above the Navy Yard, so that those 3 forts would have a triangular cannon focus for any vessel trying to invade, come into Pensacola Bay. And the fourth one would be on the ground, on the land side, and would be built facing Bayou Grande. And this, of course, would be defense against any group that might be attacking the fort of the Navy Yard from the east or through Bayou Grande itself. Now, William Chase came to Pensacola. He had the same problems, the same needs as Commodore Warrington. He had to find sources of supply, and he had to have manpower. So the first thing that Captain Chase did was to see what is here. Are there lumber yards? Are there brick yards? And he discovered that yes, there were some, but they were very small. Certainly nothing like he needed for the capacity that his work would require. So he went basically up the Escambia River, and he found sources of brick-making clay. And then he went to people who in town who obviously had some money and offered them a great opportunity. He said, if you will invest your money and build a brickyard here, I will guarantee you the full purchase of your production for up to 15 years at a very fair price. Well, 7 people took him up on it, and consequently, brickyards were established well up and down the Escambia River, and there are still remains of some of those that I guess 1 or 2 of them could still produce today if they had to. And he did the same with forest products. Now, there had been a couple of small lumber mills here, but now, of course, with this kind of volume, other mills were begun, and the idea was to have not only timber, but of course finished lumber that could be moved to the island or to the other sites to build the forts. Now, of course, they had to have barges that could be towed in one way or another from the mainland out to the site, and Chase arranged for that too. Now, the second thing that Chase had to have was skilled manpower. And like Warrington, he went into Pensacola itself and found that there was precious little there that he could draw upon. And so Chase did what Army officers, engineering officers, frequently did in that period. What was the common practice then was that an Army officer who had made some money and saved it, he did not go down to Merrill Lynch or someplace like that, invest in bonds or CDs or whatever. Instead, he would go to a slave market and buy 1, 2, 3 young black slaves. And we would put them into what we would today call a trade school, where they would be trained as carpenters, millwrights, brick masons, whatever. And when a major Army job came along, the officer in charge would turn to his fellow officers and literally lease those young slaves for the life of the project. So Mr. Chase did exactly that, brought between 25 and 30 of these well-trained young black slaves here, and some of them would be living in what we would today call almost barracks on the sites out there on the west side of the area, and they would be here, some of them almost to the year 1850. They would grow to be old men by the time they finished the project here. And so the work began. Now, he began first on the fort on the west end of Santa Rosa Island. And it took almost 5 years to actually construct this. By the time Fort Pickens was completed, it required almost 20 million brick and thousands upon thousands of feet of timber and other things to build the beautiful fortification that we see out there as a part of our historic sites today. The fort was completed and set up to have about 250 cannon of one kind or another, of course, all for defensive purposes. And when if it was in full use, it could maintain a complement of about 500 men inside the walls themselves. But then an area was set aside to the east of the fort that was cleared, and that was where a tent city could be built to maintain other troops if they were here. And of course, when we talk about Pensacola and the war between the states, we'll bring that part of the story back into focus once again. Chase continued with his work, and as I mentioned earlier, it took him almost 30 years to complete all of the forts and the redoubt that he did here. And the reason, of course, it took so long was that that project was like so many other military projects that are, of course, funded by the Congress. Funding went like this. And, of course, Chase could only proceed as rapidly as he had the money to work, and he never stopped, never slowed, I can't say he didn't slow down. He did, because the money wasn't there from time to time. But the project was consistent. He completed Fort McRae in 1839. 5 years later, Fort Barrancas was completed, and then, of course, the redoubt finished about in the latter part of 1849. And by this time, there was a sort of an unusual circumstance to it. By the time those forts were completed, and the Navy Yard, of course, was as it should have been, the need for all of this had evaporated, because by now it was obvious that the French and the English had no interest at all in moving into Latin America, so that what we had built a defense against had evaporated. So there were the fortifications. They were there, and with the exception of the Navy Yard, nothing was used at all until we came to 1861. Okay, well, let's look next at the second great change that took place here. As the Americans moved in, one of the first things, of course, that everyone here wanted, and this may seem strange to us in this year today, one of the first things they wanted to have from the new government was access to the United States mail. Now visualize where Pensacola was, where it's still in the same place today, and at that point in time, the only way one could get here was by sea. Because people have talked for years about the old Spanish Trail, and visualize that there was a great track across northwest Florida, across North Florida, where people could transport things and people themselves. But that was pretty much a myth. Of course, the first thing that the new territorial government authorized was work to improve the old trail, and we have a wonderful report written by a Corps of Engineers specialist in 1824, after he had made a survey of that road, which basically said if someone on horseback might be able to get through if he was very careful. Certainly you could not bring any kind of a vehicle across it. And what they were authorizing then was improvement of that trail, which indeed they did, but it took a long time before they did it. And there were virtually no other roads of any size or substance going north or west. Consequently, our only access to things from the outside was by sea. And one of the first things that the new Americans wanted to do was consider putting a canal arrangement through, so we would have a waterway access going west from Pensacola all the way to New Orleans. That was on the table for some time. time, but of course it never happened. By the time we get to 1829, something else was happening, not just here, but it's happening all across the United States. Because over in Great Britain, a man by the name of Henry Stephenson had found ways to develop a steam model which would be applicable to a locomotive, which would move people and things on a track. And now Stephenson's railroad idea quickly came across the Atlantic, and people were importing engines from England by 1829 and 30. We had the Camden and Cape Amboy Railroad in New Jersey that was already functioning, and one was being built in upstate New York, and people in Pensacola said, well, this is our answer. If we can now build a railroad from here, when the first point of focus was Columbus, Georgia. If we can build a railroad to Georgia, we will have access. We can join the rest of the country. We won't have to worry about going around the Keys. We won't have to worry so much about land travel. Let's get busy on a railroad. Well, one thing, of course, that a railroad had to have, building a railroad had to have, was money. And so basically the next big charge was, how are we going to get a conduit for money to sell bonds to build a railroad? Now we have to turn back the calendar about 10 years on this, because when Andrew Jackson arrived here, one of the things that he was a participant in was the signing of a memorial, which was signed by about 25 leading citizens, which was sent to the Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. At that point, again, I have to review a little bit of financial history. At that point in time, the country was still operating through the United States Bank, which was a private bank, but that was the way all of our national currency and arrangements were being funneled. In 1821, Mr. Jackson still liked the United States Bank, so he was a signator to this. Unfortunately, the United States Bank there never responded to the appeal to make this a possible state bank charter here from that facility. 10 years went by, and by the time we get into the early 1830s, now to finance the railroad, a group of leading citizens here form a team and seek a charter, again, from the bank and through the state. And they appealed. They wrote the charter, first of all, sent it off in 1831. The legislators approved it. Governor Duval rejected it. 2 years went by. Again, the appeal went through, and this time again the legislator approved it, but Mr. Duval voted against it again. But now the legislature overrode his vehicle, so now we could have the Bank of Pensacola. And so at that point in time, these same men, led by a man named Walter Gregory and half a dozen others, John Inverarity was another of the leaders, put together what they called the Bank of Pensacola. They opened their doors. They began to do business as a normal bank would. And just parenthetically, it's interesting to observe that now they had a bank, which, by the way, was located in a building at Romana and Palafox Streets. This was the first time now that we can identify that there being an official bank, there was a place for the tax collector to take the money that he had collected and put in a point of safety, or hopefully it would be safety. So that basically was, we killed two birds with one stone in that one movement. And so now these folks began to work toward the selling of bonds with which to finance a railroad. And the railroad was given a name. It was called the Alabama, Florida, Georgia Railroad, and it was to run from the docks at Pensacola to Columbus, Georgia. Mr. William Chase, the engineer who was building the forts, also became involved in this, and he, for some reason or other, became one of the leading bond salesmen. And he went to New York City, and he was very successful. Most of the bond issue was sold to investors in the Netherlands and in Great Britain. A few were sold locally, but not a whole lot. And so things went forward. The railroad was organized. A group of Irishmen were brought here to be the labor for clearing the way. And so for 1833, 34, things were looking just wonderful for the AF&G Railroad. And then came the Panic of 1837, which we'll talk about next time.